Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the life of a figure whose actual, real-world story was, honestly, just as dramatic, turbulent, and captivating as the radio soap operas she used to star in. We're talking about Eva Perón. She's often remembered as the tragic icon who completely reforged Argentina, but as you'll see, her legacy is incredibly complex, deeply polarizing, and just undeniably fascinating.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, Saint or Manipulator, the dual legacy of Eva Perón.
So pretty much everything we cover today is going to orbit around one absolutely crucial question. Was Eva Perón a genuinely benevolent champion of the poor, or was she a manipulative, carefully stage-managed propagandist for an authoritarian regime? It's a massive historical debate, right? And to really understand how she ended up at the center of it, we kind of have to hit rewind and look at exactly where she came from.
That brings us to Section 2, Out of the Pampas, the forging of a fiercely driven woman. Born Maria Eva Ibargüen in 1919, she was actually the illegitimate daughter of a wealthy rancher named Juan Duarte. And when Eva was just a single year old, her father completely abandoned her mother and their 5 children. This essentially forced the family into severe poverty. We're talking about living in a tiny 2-room house right near the railroad tracks, facing intense social ostracism. By 1930, the family packed up and moved to Junín to look for work. And then came the major leap. In 1935, at just 15 years old, Eva moved completely alone to the bustling metropolis of Buenos Aires. That early experience, the crushing poverty, being treated as a total social outcast, it profoundly impacted her worldview. It literally built this absolute, relentless drive to succeed.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is her staggering trajectory by the time she hit her early 20s. Just consider this number for a second: 6,000 pesos. When she first got to Buenos Aires, she really struggled, taking these minor acting roles and making a scant 180 pesos a month. But she was incredibly persistent and super savvy. She actually went on to form her own production company, specializing in those extremely popular radio soap operas I mentioned earlier. So by age 23, she has secured this massive contract, and her salary skyrocketed to between 5,000 and 6,000 pesos a month. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of up to 45,000 US dollars today. So it's absolutely essential to note that she was a self-made star, living in a beautiful apartment in the nicest neighborhood, long before she ever even met Juan Perón.
All right, let's see how all this builds into her entry into the highest levels of Argentine politics. Section 3, Rise to Power, from radio star to political powerhouse.
So at this time, the political landscape of Argentina was rapidly changing. In 1943, a nationalist military coup ended decades of aristocratic rule, which brought Eva into contact with government officials as they were trying to reform entertainment. Fast forward a year, a devastating earthquake hit San Juan. A rising political star named Colonel Juan Perón organizes a charity gala. Eva volunteers, they meet, and boom, they are instantly inseparable. From there, the momentum just kept building. By October 1945, Perón's championing of labor rights made him so incredibly powerful that his opponents actually had him arrested. But a massive, completely peaceful march by hundreds of thousands of workers essentially forced his release. Riding this incredible wave of popularity, Juan and a newly married Eva saw Perón elected president of Argentina in 1946 with 54% of the vote.
Now, during that massive 1945 march, it was a blisteringly hot day. A lot of the working-class men literally took off their shirts to cool down, which led to the term descamisados, or the shirtless ones. Well, Eva warmly adopted this term. It became this brilliant, highly affectionate rallying cry that permanently cemented her and Perón's connection to the working masses.
As First Lady, her political impact was, nothing short of massive. She publicly championed the 1947 women's suffrage bill and really pushed it over the finish line. But she didn't just sit back after that, no. She went on to organize the Peronist Women's Party, building over 3,000 local chapters across the country. By empowering millions of women to step into the political arena for the very first time, she almost certainly secured Perón's re-election in 1952. She literally captured nearly 63% of the female vote.
But her global image, way more complicated. In 1947, she embarked on the Rainbow Tour of Europe as a de facto ambassador. And let me tell you, the reception was incredibly divided. In Spain, she's greeted by these cheering crowds and is even given the country's highest honor by dictator Francisco Franco. But then in Italy and Switzerland, crowds are actually throwing rocks and tomatoes at her car.
Why the difference? Well, because the Peronist regime had some serious authoritarian elements and was actively providing a haven for fleeing Nazi war criminals. So to a lot of Europe, she was seen as the glamorous face of a government with some very dark fascist ties.
This dichotomy perfectly brings us to the absolute heart of her legacy. Section 4, the Eva Perón Foundation, unprecedented charity and intense criticism.
The scale of this foundation was absolutely staggering. 3 billion pesos in funding and assets. To ground that, we're talking about roughly 200 million US dollars at the time. Eva essentially completely sidelined the traditional aristocratic charity societies, the ones that had snubbed her in the past, and replaced them with this massive state-backed machine that she controlled directly. At its peak, she was receiving up to 12,000 letters a day from desperate citizens.
And this brilliantly illustrates that central tension we introduced right at the start. On one hand, you have the undeniable humanitarian works. The foundation built public schools, hospitals, housing across Argentina. Eva herself regularly worked 18 to 20-hour days, personally listening to the poor and handing them crisp 50 peso notes. But, on the other hand, we have to face the authoritarian realities. A lot of that funding came from forced, literally extorted donations from businesses. The regime aggressively muzzled political dissent, censored the press, and fostered an environment where basically only uncritical sycophants were tolerated.
Yet despite the harsh criticisms, to the working poor, she was a saint. She would physically embrace the sick. We're talking about people suffering from tuberculosis, syphilis, even leprosy. And whenever her staff tried to stop her or, swab her with alcohol, she would react with sheer outrage, telling them, think of what this show of love means to them. She genuinely believed that treating the most marginalized people with profound physical dignity was her absolute ultimate duty.
But, that same passion definitely had a darker edge to it. She proudly declared, fanaticism is the wisdom of the spirit. She openly, proudly considered herself a fanatic for Perón. To her critics, though, this kind of rhetoric wasn't just passionate, it was dangerous. They viewed her as the chief architect of the cult of Perón, arguing that she was corrupting the government by reducing citizens to mere supplicants who had to beg a benevolent mother for their basic rights, all while actively crushing anyone who dared to disagree.
This intense polarization makes our final section incredibly emotional. Section 5, the final renunciation, a tragic end, an enduring legacy.
Right at the very height of her power, tragedy struck. In 1950, Eva was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And despite her rapidly failing health, in 1951, Perón actually nominated her for vice president. The working class, the descamisados, were ecstatic. But the conservative members of the government and the military, they were absolutely horrified at the prospect of this incredibly powerful working class woman potentially assuming the presidency if Perón were to die.
So, the crucial point is how this incredible political pressure, combined with her rapidly failing physical body, culminated in her famous August 1951 renunciation broadcast. Over the radio, she officially declined the vice presidency. In a deeply emotional speech, she stated that her only ambition was that history would remember her as the woman who devoted her life to conveying the people's hopes to the president, and whom the people lovingly called Evita. Her physical decline after that was incredibly rapid. Despite undergoing surgery and intense treatments, Eva Perón passed away on July 26, 1952. She was only 33 years old. The public grief that followed was chaotic, just totally unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands of people stood vigil. As her body was moved to lie in state, the sheer desperation of the surging crowd trying to just touch her coffin was so intense that 8 people were tragically trampled to death. That right there is the sheer scale of the devotion she commanded. Which brings us right back to where we started. We've traced her journey from extreme poverty and illegitimacy to the highest pinnacle of power. We've looked at her undeniable charity, her massive empowerment of women, and her deep, genuine connection with the working class. But we've also unpacked the censorship, the forced donations, and her undeniable role in an authoritarian cult of personality. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I'm going to leave the final verdict to you. Was Eva Perón a genuinely benevolent champion of the poor, or a manipulative propagandist? Weigh the history we've explored today and decide for yourself. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep exploring.